The cigarette smoke had settled low along the ceiling of the studio on West 44th Street, and Quincy Jones hadn't moved from his chair in 20 minutes. Not because he was listening, because he was waiting for Marvin Gaye to do something that made sense, something that fit inside the framework Quincy had spent 20 years constructing, the framework of jazz theory, of Miles Davis's phrasing, of Count Basie's arrangements, of everything that could be explained, taught, written down on a staff, and handed to another musician who would understand it immediately. Quincy was the kind of man who heard music as architecture. He knew where every wall should be. He knew how a room should hold sound. And when Marvin sat across from him that evening, hands folded on the table, saying almost nothing, Quincy watched him the way a surgeon watches a patient who insists he doesn't feel pain, with professional skepticism, with quiet certainty that the diagnosis had already been made. It was the spring of 1971, and What's Going On had just hit the streets. The record was moving. Nobody could deny that. But inside certain rooms, in certain conversations, among the men who believed they understood what music was and what it could be, there was a hesitation, a reluctance to call it what the public was already calling it. Quincy had heard it twice. He had sat with it, turned it over, studied the chord structures and the layered harmonics, and the way Marvin had stacked his own voice against itself like he was arguing with a mirror. It was unusual. It was emotionally striking in ways that were difficult to dismiss. But Quincy Jones had worked with Miles Davis when Miles was reinventing the entire language of modern music. He had sat in rooms with Dizzy Gillespie, had arranged for Frank Sinatra, had conducted orchestras across 3 continents. He understood what genius looked like when it was disciplined, when it could account for itself, when a musician could sit down and explain every choice he had made and why. Marvin couldn't do any of that. Marvin played by feel, by instinct, by something that didn't have a name in any textbook. And for a man like Quincy, that was almost more troubling than impressive. The meeting had been informal, arranged by a mutual acquaintance who thought the 2 men should talk. Quincy had agreed, more out of courtesy than curiosity. He'd brought a yellow notepad, force of habit, the kind of pad he filled during every session, every conversation, every moment when music was being discussed, and he needed to capture the architecture before it dissolved. Marvin had brought nothing. He sat in the chair across from Quincy with the easy, unhurried stillness of a man who had nowhere else to be. And when Quincy started talking about what's going on, about the interesting risk of the concept, about the places where the harmonic structure was unconventional in ways that could have gone wrong, Marvin just listened, didn't nod aggressively, didn't take notes, didn't lean forward the way people do when they want you to know they're paying attention. He simply absorbed it, the way a room absorbs sound, quietly, completely, without echo. Quincy said at some point that the record had a certain intuitive quality that was undeniable. He chose the word intuitive carefully. It was a word that acknowledged something without fully endorsing it. Intuitive meant real but uncontrolled. Intuitive meant you got lucky with your instincts. It was different from saying the work was precise or structured or the product of genuine technical mastery. Marvin heard the distinction. He didn't say so. He just looked at Quincy for a moment with those half-lidded eyes that people who knew him always found impossible to read, and then he said that he appreciated the word, appreciated it the way you appreciate a gift you didn't ask for. And then he asked if Quincy wanted to come to the studio that night. The studio was in Midtown, a narrow room with a control booth that smelled like old coffee and soldering iron, the kind of place that had hosted hundreds of sessions that would never be famous. The engineer on duty was a young man named Earl who had worked with Marvin before and who moved around the equipment with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood his job was to stay invisible. Quincy sat in the control booth with Earl, yellow notepad on his knee, and watched through the glass as Marvin settled himself in front of the microphone. There was no band, no session musicians, just a backing track on tape, stripped down, almost skeletal. Bass, drums, a faint organ that seemed to hover rather than play. Marvin stood at the microphone and was still for a long moment, eyes closed, head slightly bowed, like a man in a church he hadn't visited in years but still remembered how to enter. Quincy uncapped his pen. He was ready to take notes. That was the thing about Quincy Jones in a studio. He was always working, always cataloging, always finding the technical language for what he heard. It was how he had survived decades in an industry that consumed people. It was how he turned the chaos of creation into something manageable, something that could be replicated and refined and improved upon. He pressed the cap of the pen against the notepad and waited for Marvin to begin, already preparing the vocabulary he would use to describe what he heard. Harmonic deviation, rhythmic displacement, tonal register, the architecture of the thing. And then Marvin opened his mouth. What came out of that microphone in those first few seconds was not what Quincy had prepared himself for. It wasn't the smooth, polished, romantic tenor he associated with Marvin's Motown output, the voice that had sold millions of records by being safe and beautiful and perfectly calibrated for radio. It wasn't the controlled, deliberate phrasing of a trained vocalist working within a structure. It was something rawer than that, something that seemed to come from a place so deep inside the man that the microphone almost seemed inadequate as a vessel. The first note landed not like a musical choice, but like a confession. Extended, unsupported, hanging in the air of the booth, with nowhere to go except further inward. And then the second note, which moved in a direction that made no theoretical sense and absolute emotional sense simultaneously. And then the third, which should not have been beautiful but was devastatingly so. Quincy's pen had stopped moving. He didn't notice it at first. He was too focused on what was happening through the glass, on the figure of Marvin standing at the microphone with his eyes still closed, his body completely relaxed, one hand hanging at his side and the other resting lightly at his throat. Not pressing, just resting, as if feeling the vibration of something that was passing through him on its way somewhere else. The voice was doing things that Quincy could not locate on any staff, could not explain with any of the language he had spent a lifetime accumulating. Not because the choices were random. They weren't random. They were precise with a kind of precision that operated below the level of theory, below the level of instruction, below everything that could be taught or transferred or written down. It was the precision of lived experience translated directly into sound without anything lost in the translation. The session ran for 40 minutes. Marvin did 3 takes of the same piece, and each take was different, not in the way that mistakes are different, but in the way that 3 true things said about the same subject are different. Each one complete, each one arriving at the same destination by a slightly different road. Between takes, Marvin said almost nothing. He accepted a glass of water from Earl, rolled his neck once, looked out through the glass at Quincy with an expression that was not challenging but not deferential either. Just present, just there, fully, in the room, in the moment, in himself. It was in the silence between the second and third take that Quincy looked down and realized his notepad was blank. He had written nothing. Not a single technical observation, not a harmonic notation, not the kind of architectural shorthand he used to capture the structure of a session. The page was as empty as when he had uncapped the pen 40 minutes earlier. And for a man who took notes the way other people breathe, who processed music by describing it, who understood sound by translating it into something that could be examined and discussed and improved, that blank page was more significant than any review he had ever read. It meant that what he had heard in those 40 minutes could not be reduced to the language he had spent his entire career learning to speak. It meant the framework he had built, the one he trusted above almost everything else, had encountered something it could not fully contain. The third take ended. The tape kept running for a few seconds after Marvin stopped, recording the ambient hiss of the room, the faint mechanical breath of the equipment. Then Earl reached forward and stopped the reel. Marvin stood at the microphone a moment longer, eyes still closed. Then he opened them, looked through the glass, and the expression on his face was the same easy stillness it had been at the beginning. Not satisfied, not triumphant, not seeking confirmation, just present, just finished. Quincy set the pen down on the notepad. He did not say the word that was closest to what he was feeling, which was the word that serious musicians with serious careers and serious reputations are slowest to say about other serious musicians. He said instead that the third take was the one. He said it quietly to Earl, as if reporting a simple fact. Earl nodded. Marvin, who could not have heard from inside the booth, seemed to know anyway. He lifted the headphones from around his neck and placed them carefully on the stand, and then he walked out of the vocal booth and through the side door, and when he came into the control room, he accepted another glass of water and sat down in the chair beside Quincy and said nothing. They stayed like that for a while, the two of them, side by side in the narrow control booth, with the tape stopped and the overhead lights humming faintly and the yellow notepad sitting empty on Quincy's knee. Outside, the city continued its operations. The taxis and the voices and the perpetual machinery of a place that doesn't stop. Inside, something had settled, not resolved, not completed. Something had simply landed in the room and been allowed to remain. Quincy said eventually that he hadn't written anything down. Marvin looked at the notepad and said he could see that, and then Marvin smiled. Not the stage smile, not the performance, but the small private thing behind it, the one that very few people ever got to see. And he said that sometimes that was the point, that the music worth making was the kind that made the pen go still, that the moment a voice could be fully described was the moment it stopped being fully alive. Quincy looked at him for a long time after that, not the way he had looked at him earlier in the evening, with the clinical patience of a man waiting for the data to confirm his hypothesis. Something different. The way a man looks at a view he didn't expect and has no immediate words for. He did not become a different person after that night. Quincy Jones remained who he was, disciplined, architectural, extraordinary in ways that belonged entirely to him. He went on to build one of the most remarkable careers in the history of American music. But the people who knew him well, who had worked with him across the decades, who had sat with him in studios from New York to Los Angeles, and watched him fill notepad after notepad with the technical observations that were his way of living inside music. Those people said that from time to time, when the conversation turned to a certain kind of voice, a certain kind of raw and inexplicable precision, Quincy would go quiet for a moment in a way that was different from his usual focused silence. And sometimes when someone pressed him, when someone asked what he was thinking, he would say something that sounded simple but wasn't. He would say, "There's what you can explain, and then there's what walks through the room and leaves you with a blank page. And that blank page," he would say, "is not a failure. That blank page is the whole point."